So welcome to COPDEI webinar presentation first in the 2008 to the 19 academic school year. So Dr. Nia Imani is our speaker today. She's a 4-H specialist, a principal agent at the University of Maryland eXtension. She has a doctorate degree in urban educational leadership. She has created and led several youth and community programs in New York, Delaware, and Maryland. Dr. Nia Imani's area of research interest are youth development, community development, outreach programming, curriculum development, and diversity, inclusion, and belonging. Over to Dr. Nia Imani.
All right. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the introduction and thank you for hosting eXtension. So as was mentioned, my name is Nia Imani Fields, and today we're going to be talking about social capital, social justice, and how that kind of intersects with positive youth development. So a little bit about myself. I'm originally from New York, so I still claim to be a New Yorker, even though I've been in Maryland for about 18 years now. My research interest and just programmatic and career interest has always been working with youth and communities. More recently, I've been looking more at how youth development can be a contributing factor to social capital. And actually, I'm a part of a research team. I see some of the members on this morning that we are exploring how 4-H can contribute to social capital. Been taking it a little step further to see how this might be a contributing factor to providing or increasing a youth's agency or efficacy that they may address issues of injustice within their own communities or what they see around them. So that's a little bit about my interest and what I bring to the table today. So I have been doing some research about inequities in education. So I just kind of wanted to lay the framework to where much of this work that I'm going to share today stems from. So I was interested in inequitable access to quality education as the form of social injustice, right? So there are many forms of social injustice related to healthcare, water quality, all types of things. I'm focusing today on education. And also looking at inequities to accessing social capital. And that's not to minimize the different forms of social capital that exist within communities and among different groups, but I'm looking more at social capital that can help you overcome issues of poverty or inequities in education, for example. And it can be argued that part of what makes an educational experience inequitable is limited access to social capital. If you think about having resources and networks to mentors, tutors to help you with your homework assignments, resources within the community when you have to do particular research on a topic in your classes, and having references or financial aid to get into college. So these are types of things that can be attributed to resources in social capital. So looking at some of the inequities within education, there are a few authors that talk a lot about this. Darling Hammond is one of them who talks about there is a misconception in our country and in our world really that education is equal and that everyone has access to public education, so everyone has an equal playing ground to be successful in schools and beyond. Unfortunately, that's not the case. There are inadequate resources within schools, particularly those schools that are mostly populated by people of color or in urban communities. There's unprepared teachers or teachers that don't relate to the students in which there is to serve. And then there's lower expectations of students of color. So there's a belief that there's limits to what can be achieved by students of color as opposed to offering the resources that are needed for every child to be able to succeed. Children of color are overrepresented in special education. They're disproportionately expelled from school because there are different acceptable behaviors that we kind of accept in the school system and even in our communities. And if those behaviors aren't in line with administration or with school policy, they're looked at as, quote, bad children that can't exist within a typical classroom. And then there's absence of culturally relevant pedagogy or culturally relevant teaching practices in schools and even within positive youth development, within our own extension programs. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So there's we often hear the term achievement gap, and Gloria Ladson-Billings is one theorist and educator who says there's not really an achievement gap as much as there is an education debt that is owed to students of color in this country. If we go back to when public education became structured in this or organized in this country, students of color, Black children, and others were not legally allowed to go to school. They weren't legally allowed to learn to read. That's a different playing field than our white students here in this country. And you have to think about how that has transpired over the years and how systematically and historically that has influenced our education today. So there's a debt that is owed to students of color in this country when we look at education and other human resources and networks that exist within our country. So 3 terms that we're going to focus on a little bit more, just want to lay the groundwork so we have common understanding of these terms today. So social injustice today will represent the societal inequities that marginalize groups by diminishing access for today, talking about quality education. But you can replace those 2 last words with anything really. Diminishing access to any resource that should be available to any human being in our world. Inequitable education, I mentioned, is describing the institutional systemic racism and social injustices that have kind of plagued schools and other community resources throughout history. So things like I mentioned, inadequate resources, unprepared teachers, having lower expectations of students of color. And then social capital will focus, if you think of the word networks and relationships, that's how I like to describe social capital. It's the networks and relationships that increases a person's access to privilege or resources that may have not been available to them without these networks and resources. And it can help communities solve problems together, right? If they're making more connections, if they're connecting with organizations and decision-making bodies, governmental institutions, once you make those connections, you're more likely to have the ability to address issues that are important to you. So this is an image that I'd like to share because there's often a misconception between these terms, particularly equality and equity. They're often used interchangeably, but they are quite different. And this picture describes that nicely when equality describes the same for every person, right? Everyone has a box there to see the game, but as you can see in the graphic, there are there's at least one child who can't see the game, and one who's kind of making it, but they have the barrier there, and then one who has plenty of space, right? He can see the game with or without the box. Equity is when you're giving the resources that are needed to achieve whatever outcome you're seeking, right? So if the outcome here is to see the game, not everyone needs a box. Some people need more than one box, right? So the person who did not need the box can then share it with someone who did not, who wasn't able to see with just the one box. So it's giving out the resources that are needed to achieve the outcome that you're seeking. Liberation is the ideal, right? It'll take us quite a bit of time to get here, and this is the ideal when there aren't any more barriers. So no one needs the box because everyone has equal access to view the game. And I was recently at a training, and there was a comment made that was powerful also, is when are these folks going to have the option to even play in the game, right? So that's kind of a leap that you can make in your mind, is that not everyone even has access to play on that field. So that can be even a step further. How do we make sure everyone has access to achieve whatever outcome they are seeking? So let me stop just for a couple of minutes to see if you can, in the chat box, answer this question if you have an answer. What's an example of a youth program that is seeking to offer equity as opposed to equality? So are there things that you've done in your program or that you've seen in other programs where they are doing what's needed for an equitable program as opposed to an equal program? And I'll just give a minute or two to see if there's some thoughts here. Right, I'm not seeing any just yet, but I'll keep an eye on the chat box in case you all think of some answers there. Feel free to chat and write in there as we go along here. All right, so what's a possible response to these inequities that we're talking about? And thank you, Janet. I do see a comment, so let me just pause to read that. So in Clackamas, Colorado, and I apologize if I butchered that word or that county, 4-H STEM Beyond School has a Latinx outreach program. So Janet, if you feel free to add some details there so everyone can benefit from what's happening there in Colorado, that would be awesome. So what's a possible response to some of these inequities that I've mentioned? It's plausible to consider the value of social capital, as I mentioned, in the context of solving problems together, building networks, and increasing resources so that youth and adults together can address issues that they see in their schools, in their community, and in the world around them. We can also think of social capital as a resource that combats social exclusion. So there are cases where social capital can be a negative thing, right? If you think of the country club mentality where you need to have special rights or access to get into that network of people. So that can be exclusionary. And some may argue that 4-H can do the same thing, right? If you don't understand the lingo, if you don't know people who are already in the organization, or if 4-H has not historically been in your community, it might be harder for you to join and have access to the resources of that land grant through 4-H program. However, if you're using social capital in a positive way, you're moving beyond your immediate bond of people and you're linking and connecting with folks in different circles. So that's kind of the ideal version of social capital, or when you're having communities that are bonded together, network with others. And then youth that have social capital are better able to navigate and negotiate barriers that might exist within their community. So going back to the graphic, if you knew a person who had boxes, then you might be able to advocate for a box for yourself. But if you had no idea who had the boxes or where to get those boxes, you may be stuck in that same situation of not seeing that baseball game. So let's explore social capital a little more closely. I kind of mentioned this, but social capital is not equally available to all members of a society or community. And folks that are lacking the social capital, or folks that are lacking social capital, and they're in communities of poverty or these type of circumstances, they can be magnified if you don't have those resources to combat issues that come with living in poverty, or issues that come with you know, all the other injustices that might exist within a community, whether it's healthcare, whether it's the judicial system, or your educational system. If you don't have these resources, it might make that circumstance even more magnified. So there are 7 community capitals that Flora and Flora posit are needed to have vibrant communities, strong families, and successful youth. I'm not going to go into all of these today. We're focusing on social capital, but just for your own information, these include political capital, financial capital, built capital, cultural, natural, and human capital. And then social capital is the one we're focusing on today. But I do encourage you all to, if you're not familiar with this particular framework, to explore it a little further if you're really looking at developing communities, because all of these things need to intersect to have vibrant communities and successful youth. So social capital, like I mentioned, is what we're focusing on. So there are the bonding networks that I mentioned. These are the close ties that you have with folks who are similar to you. So these are folks in your family. These are folks in your community that you connect with most closely. These are the folks that help you get by day to day. They're pretty in similar situations, socioeconomically, culturally, values-wise. These are your folks who you're close with. They help you get by day to day. Then you have your bridging networks. These are folks outside of your immediate circle. So these are folks like your mentors, or someone who can write a job recommendation for you, someone who's tutoring you through school, someone in a community that has an access to a resource to get that box, if we're sticking with that story. So these are folks that can help you get ahead, right? They're offering you connections to new resources, introducing you to new people that can help provide you access to opportunities you may not have had before. And then there's linking networks. These are connections to organizations government bodies. Think of our land grant institutions as a linking network. These are organizations that can help bring about change, right? So you're moving away from just individual connection to now connecting with organizations, with businesses, with government to advocate for policy change, to advocate for financial resources to be given to different people or groups of people. So these are organizations that can bring about change. So bonding is get by, bridging is get ahead, and linking is bring about change. Among these different networks, you have different levels of trust and engagement. So you can imagine your bonding networks, you probably have the highest level of trust, right? These are your close circle folks. So there's different levels of trust within these different groups. And some of the research I've done has shown that there's less trust within people of color and organizations like universities or the government. We can think of tons of reasons, right? Immigration being one of them right now, where if you are immigrant to this country, you may not have the same level of trust in a government organization, even if they are trying to provide you access to a resource, right? So those are things we need to consider when working with certain audiences who might have some trepidation in working with a land grant or working with some of our partners. All of these things together can increase the efficacy of, in my work, a young person or an adult. So that belief that they can make a difference, right? They now know people. And a lot of, we often say it's not what you know, but who you know, right? So if you know people, if you believe in yourself because of the networks and resources that you now have, if you have increased opportunity, so for an example, in 4-H, if you were to visit a college campus, you may now believe that you can be there as a student, right? That experience of doing something that you may not have had the opportunity to do before might change your whole mentality about what's possible for you. So our job as educators is how can we increase the efficacy or the agency in the young people or adults that we work with, or communities as a whole. So I'll pause again to see if there's one way that your program has developed social capital. So that's the networks, trust, engagement, or agency in young people or adults. Has your program increased or helped develop any of those aspects of social capital? You can put your responses in the chat box if you have an example to share with the group. And I'll just point out that Janet did explain a little further that 4-H is working with Latinx communities to increase social capital. Mark has shared that he's working with local partners like churches and community members. And I would assume, Mark, you're talking about maybe building collaborations between the partners so that they're no longer working in isolation, perhaps, but they're working together.
Yeah, and a lot of the folks that I'm working with or that I do webinars for are sharing their experiences, and they're having a lot of positive responses from working with community members, specifically within the Latin community. I've done a couple of webinars actually as a part of the diversity inclusion webinar series we've done, and a lot of those folks that are extension professionals working with the Latin community, the church, and church members have been a big part of the work that they're doing to sort of help build trust within those communities.
Great. And yes, trust is a big word, right? So often I would say extension puts the cart before the horse with wanting to get into new communities without remembering that key ingredient to building a new partnership, trust. If you don't have that, and if you don't take the time to nurture that, then you aren't going to have a long-lasting relationship or partnership, right? We often are bringing our experience and understanding to communities without doing it jointly and building our networks together and valuing what resources they already have. Joanne shares that providing scholarships so young people who couldn't experience things on their own means would have the opportunity to attend national events. That's great. Developing relationships take time, and valuing that, yeah. So thinking about how we allocate our resources, for those of us in Extension and 4-H, how are we making sure that folks who didn't have access financially are having that? And are we making the accessibility of accessing those resources feasible, right? What are we asking from them to provide scholarships? What do they need to achieve to earn that scholarship? Sometimes those aren't inequitable. Sometimes we expect the same type of thing from all of our participants so that they can earn a trip to a national event without thinking what some of those barriers might be. What's their comfort level with leaving their community for the first time, if that's the case for them? So thinking about all of these circumstances. And Leonardo is sharing that programs that not only give youth and adults of color a voice, but that their voices and realities are believed and not denied or refuted. That's a key point. Thank you for sharing that. So once we are, if we're asking to understand folks better, but then we are sharing with them why this is inaccurate or what the research shows that negates what they're saying, their truth, then we're doing a disservice, right? We're perpetuating the injustice if we are devaluing their voice. And we often do that in research because many of us are academics and we're studying things for years and we feel like we have a good handle on something. And then someone comes along whose story is just in opposition to what we have learned or know to be true. And we are ready to kind of share why their story might not be quite accurate or why it's isolated to just them and not a whole group of people. But we need to take more time to value the stories of the people just as much as we value the textbooks and the articles that we read. So thank you, Leonardo, for sharing that. So let's explore social justice. So there's lots of words on here. I'm going to focus on the principles piece, and I'll point out some examples of practices. And I encourage you all to look up Jen Wright and Camerota, who go into more detail about social justice youth development. And I can certainly share this PowerPoint afterwards. But if you're looking to have a social justice youth development program, there's some things that need to be there. The first is that you have an opportunity to analyze power in social relationships. So the youth are understanding what power is, who has the power in their life, whether that's in the school system, whether that's in their community or among their friends and community. So understanding what power is and how that plays out in community. You're making identity central. So the young person or the adult in your program is the center of your program, not the research, not the educator, but the young person that you're serving, right? They're at the center and you're trying to find ways that's to celebrate their identity, critiquing the stereotypes that exist around their identity. You're also going to be promoting systemic social change. And I'll say, and some of the work that I've been doing recently talks about that doesn't just mean systemic issues in the schools or in the community. We have to look at eXtension and 4-H also, right? So what are the issues within 4-H that might be oppressive or that might be limiting access to certain people? And that goes for eXtension also with programs outside of 4-H. Are our systems doing that? And then even deeper, among our faculty, staff, educators within our organization, what are some of the barriers there that might be limiting full engagement of our folks? And then you're encouraging collective action. So encouraging young people to share their voice, right? Giving them the freedom to use that agency. So we might not be, as educators, the ones, going to the marches with our young people, but we could be providing them the tools and resources so that they feel they are prepared to exercise their voice if that's how they choose to do so. So the March for Our Lives is a great example where youth organized themselves to speak against gun violence in our country. And there were teachers there that were supporting them as well. So there are ways that young people, and there have been ways historically where young people have been the voice of social justice in our country. And then embracing youth culture. So that's their language, their beliefs, their values. How can we celebrate their culture as opposed to minimizing their culture and valuing our own as adults or as educators more? So these are the types of things that need to happen if you want social justice to be the root of your youth development program. Right now I have a piece that's going through peer review. It's a guiding document for educators around social justice youth development. And it goes into more detail on these categories and talks about how to actually put this into practice in your program. So I'm hoping that will be ready in the next month or two. So you can feel free to reach out to me if you're interested in having access to that. But really looking at putting this theory into practice is our next step. So how does youth development align with social capital and social justice? So many folks are familiar with the essential elements of 4-H. 4-H youth development says that all youth should have the opportunity to belong, to master a skill, to practice independence, and then to practice generosity by giving back to others, right? Some of the research I've done has shown that there are sometimes inequities in who really does belong. I think many of us can speak to that from our own experiences, perhaps. Even as an educator, I haven't felt like I've always belonged when I go to national 4-H events, because I might be the only one who looks like me, or I might be the only one from an urban community, or I might be the only decision maker of color at the table. So there's been examples when I felt like I didn't belong. So think about how our young people might feel in a program where they're coming to a place that hasn't been historically for them. Are we providing opportunities for them to be nurtured and to feel like they're safe? And then mastery, so having opportunities to engage in learning and master a skill. This can be attributed to social justice if you think about, or social capital, if you think about the agency and efficacy. So once you master a skill, your belief in yourself can increase, right? You believe you can accomplish something successfully. Then having an opportunity to be independent. So see yourself as a young person, as an active participant in the future. So are we giving youth the voice and the platform to exercise what they believe to be true? Or if they are in opposition to something that is a practice or an example of injustice, how are we supporting them so that they can practice that independence? And how are they deciding what is an issue for them, as opposed to us bringing this to the table? And generosity, practicing valuing others, seeing folks outside of just themselves, and then practice service for others. That can be connected to social justice. And in just a little bit, I'm going to share some of the considerations that I've made to this model to show how we can be more explicit in that. So in red, and hopefully your color isn't as, hopefully you can tell the red. But some changes that I have made as considerations are looking at mastery, when it can't just be engagement and learning, but it has to be culturally relevant learning, right? So we can't use a one-size-fits-all curriculum that sometimes is used within our youth development programs. We have to make sure that the learning is meaningful and relatable to the youth that we're serving. Have them be at the table with deciding what they are interested in learning more about, and use terminology and pictures and voices and stories that are relevant to them. And then with independence, I added the word efficacy so that we can be more explicit in that, right? So you're building that agency and efficacy so that you can see yourself as an active participant, not only in the future, really, and that can even be tweaked, but today. How can you be an active participant as a young person today and into the future? And then for generosity, I added a ninth potential element to consider is not just practicing service for others. So not just doing community service projects, which are important and valuable, but how can you actually take a stance against injustice and take a stance towards justice, so that you're not just putting Band-Aids on issues through your projects and activities in your club or program, but you're looking at ways to change the institutional barriers that might exist. So an example of that a lot of young people might do is collect canned goods around the holiday times for families who don't have access to food, right? How can you take that a step further and understand why food insecurity exists? Does it exist in your community? If so, why? What are some of the things that you can do in your schools to make sure that youth have access to fruit and vegetables and they don't feel less than if they're accessing free lunch or free breakfast at their schools? How can you look at where grocery stores are located and why some communities have them and some don't? And what can you do to advocate for change, even as a young person, or along with your families who are adults, to make some change? So it's being more intentional about striving for justice as opposed to just fixing individual issues. And feel free along the way, if you have questions or comments, to add that to the chat. We also use, and I know there's lots of language here, we also use the 5 C's of positive youth development that Lerner has shared. And so in red, you'll see some changes that some considerations rather that I have suggested. So the connection can't just be with people, right? Those immediate bonds that we talked about with social capital can't only be with people who are similar to you. There's limitations there. There has to be bonds with folks of diverse backgrounds so that you can understand and have more empathy for people who are different than you or had different lived experiences. Going back to Leonardo's comment, if you don't connect and communicate with people who are different, then you don't have the opportunity to value their voice and their experience. The same with character. We can't only have respect for norms. What was typically there was respect for norms and possession of standards. We have to be acceptable of diverse cultural norms and values. We have to understand some communities or some people may find it disrespectful to shake hands. Some may look down as opposed to looking up when they're speaking to you. Some are more vocal, some are more quiet or passive. There's different norms within different cultures. And if we don't understand that, then we might make the assumption that they are being disrespectful or that they have poor behavior. So we have to understand the cultural norms. It's our responsibility as educators to understand the norms and the cultures of the youth and communities that we're working with. And then in order to be caring and compassionate, you have to understand what privilege is. Only then can you really build a sense of sympathy and empathy for others, if you understand that in this country, some people have and some people don't. And it's not happenstance that this happens, right? There's some systems in place that allow certain groups to have and certain groups to not have. So we have to understand what that is, who they are, in order for us to build empathy. And then these 5 C's are to then lead to the 6th C, which is contribution, contributing to self, family, and community. And then I've added engagement in service and collective action to address social injustice. So again, it's not just contributing to your community, but really looking at the systems that might need to be altered so that more people can see that baseball game, right? So the last graphic I'll share, and then I'll open it up for questions and conversation through chat, is a critical experiential learning model. So in 4-H, we often use the experiential learning model in our curriculum and in our teaching. So this isn't to replace that. This is when you're thinking about critical education or wanting to explore an issue more deeply with social injustice at the root. This is a framework that you might consider. So the yellow circle there is the same for the most part. It's experiencing the activity. This activity, though, should be culturally relevant, and it should involve socio-political education. Again, if you're looking to explore injustice within a community, you have to talk about the social factors and the political and historical factors that relate to that issue. So if you're going back to the example of food insecurity, you need to talk about what food deserts are. You need to talk about the economics behind agriculture and the food system and why some folks have access and some don't. You can take it outside of this country. Why do some countries that are rich in resources have a limited access to their basic needs of water and food? And then you're sharing what you've learned. So you're having rational discourse. You're thinking critically about the issue by sharing your thoughts on it, and then you're processing it. So you're critically analyzing or experiencing the issue for yourself. So you're talking a little more deeply about why these things exist, why some groups have, why some groups don't have, and why did this come to be? How did this start? You can even look at it within our own programs. Then you're generalizing it. So you're connecting what was learned to the larger story of social injustice and equity. And then finally, this one looks the most different from our experiential learning model. You're engaging in collective action. So that might include service, that might include civic engagement or community organizing, all of those things that connect to action, or how Freire has described it to be praxis. So acting, using your agency and acting on that to bring about change. So I'll pause here to see, how could you put this into practice? Do you all have programs that have done some of this, but maybe the 5th aspect here wasn't fully developed? Or perhaps you are doing all of these things really well and you can share that with the group. So I'm done with the lecture part of today's presentation. I really want to hear from you all with questions or examples of how you can put this into practice. And Adegoke, if there are questions in the Q&A, feel free to let me know.
Adegoke, you'll need to unmute yourself. You got it.
Yes.
Just there were some questions about the presentation. Nia, Nia shared the presentation with me. I'll share that on the Learn event. I assume most people got here via the Learn event. I'll put a link to her presentation on the Learn event if she's okay with that.
Sure. Yes. I also wrote an article that talks a little bit more about the research that led to this presentation. It's on the Journal of Extension. I think it's called Considerations to Social Capital and Social Justice, or something to that effect. But if you Google social justice 4-H on Journal of Extension, it should come up. It goes into a little bit more detail about these models that I shared at the end.
If you'll share that with me, I can put that on the Learn event too.
Perfect.
Nia.
Will do. Yep.
I'll prime the pump questions-wise. I was just wondering, in the beginning you talked about schools, and this may be outside of the scope, or you may not have any information to share, but just wondering about charter, public charter, and magnet schools. Do you feel like that's addressing some of the social justice issues with regard to race and underserved groups in the United States?
Yeah, I think that's really a case-by-case basis. In Maryland, charter schools are public schools, so they have a lot of similarities in how they're funded and some of the expectations. I think from what I've learned and experienced, a lot of what happens in the school is a direct reflection of the administration and the teachers in the building, right? Or the staff in the building. So some counties and cities are more progressive in the county level expectations to be more culturally relevant and to hire diverse teachers and staff, and to have practices that are battling or combating inequity. But if it doesn't trickle down to the administrator in the building or to the teachers in the building, then it often stops. That happens in any organization. You can have an ideal situation as a policy or practice, expected practice, but if it doesn't trickle down, then it's for naught. So I think that's where I focus a lot on our responsibility as educators. We have a responsibility to combat injustice within communities. We can no longer just be indifferent, because if we are being indifferent to what's happening around us, then we are perpetuating this issue. So we might not feel, like we need to be, and we don't all have to be, radical activists. That's not everyone's vision for themselves, and that's fine. But if you don't acknowledge privilege, if you don't acknowledge oppression, if you don't acknowledge all the isms that exist within our world and that youth are bringing to the table, then we are doing a disservice to ourselves and to the youth and adults that we're serving.
Right.
I do see a question here. Do I see a connection between the critical experiential learning model and Freire's education model? So yes, Jose, yes, I do, and I have him listed in my resources there. He was one of the theorists and educators and activists who helped lead to some of my work here. So all of his work around action and all of his work around how to engage the community in learning, learning from each other, not the banking model when educators are bringing all of our knowledge to communities, but we are learning from each other and valuing each other's knowledge as equal. So certainly, he certainly influenced this here. And Leonardo is confirming that one of our most important roles in working with youth is the development of critical consciousness, right? Not in just youth and adults, and engaging us in discussion about the cost of injustice, not just for us, or for all of us, right? Not just marginalized, right? And I talk a lot about that also, and it might be in the article where we talk about taking the time to learn about the differences and the inequities among people is not just for the benefit of the person who is oppressed, right? For the humankind to survive and to thrive, we all need to care about each other. We need to be more empathetic and understand circumstances. And that means giving up something that you might have so that someone else has access to just enough to survive, right? So it doesn't just benefit, and we talk about the importance of diversity all the time and how that creates more of a creative space and more opportunities for value of voices to be at the table. So we have to provide the space for that to happen, all right? Because we all can succeed from every person having the opportunity to thrive. How do you work this model with adult leaders who need to be invested to do this with their clubs? So that piece I talked about, Diana, is some of what's going to be included in that resource guide I mentioned. It talks about some practical things that can be done with volunteers or by the volunteers in youth groups. I think a starting point that I often use is building empathy. That's usually a starting point for me. And there's a few different things that can take place for that to happen. But if you don't understand the effect of someone not having access to something that you have access to, then you might not be ready to care about rational discourse and critically analyzing a circumstance or issue. So building empathy, that graphic that I showed is always an easy starting ground because it puts into visual what equity is, because that's often a touchy point, and you know, we all should just be equal, everyone's the same. As long as I do the same for every child in my program, they all will succeed. So taking some time to talk about what those boxes mean and to actually talk about literally what those boxes represent in the club program, in a school system. You know, what are some examples that folks can discuss that might represent those boxes? Starting to build that empathy before you can then get to, all right, now that you understand that some folks don't have what they need to be successful in their childhood or in their life, what can I do to provide that access or to that network for that child to have something that they may have needed to get into college or to study for a test or to do a service project in their community. Make sure I didn't see any other. All right, and Janet mentioned that they're doing a lot of things, but this information will help them be more strategic and intentional. Yeah, that's been the word of the month for me. I've used the word intentional a lot lately because I think that's often a missing part. We do a lot of these things just because we care about it, but we do need to be more intentional. That's how you make sustainable change, when you were intentional in these practices and then putting policies into place that have these practices be more ingrained in our work and in our programs. Do you have any other questions on your end, Adegoke?
No, not right now.
Okay. Well, I thank you all for taking the time to hear me speak today, and I thank you for your contributions to the conversation today. Feel free to send me an email if you have questions or if you want to chat a little deeper about any of these topics. I'm more than happy to do that with you all. And just stay tuned for that resource that I mentioned. I really do think it's a great next step to how we can put more of these policies and practice or theories into practice in our everyday work. So thank you all. I'll turn it back over to Adegoke.
I don't know if you'd like to share your presentation, the PowerPoint with our members, the participants today. I think that would be appreciated. Yes,
Mark has it, so I believe he's going to email it or post it on the eXtension Learn site.
Yeah, and I'm going to put a link in chat, folks. Just I assume you probably got here via that Learn event, but in case you didn't, the link's in chat. If you'll go back and just check there within, probably by this afternoon, I'll update that with, I'll add the presentation, and then Nia, if you'll send me the Joe article you did, I may be able to find it on my own, but if you would, go ahead and follow up with a link to that. I'll put that on the Learn site, and then also the recording, once we make it available, it'll probably take a couple, 3 days for that to happen. The recording will be available of this webinar at that location too.
Great. Thank you all.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.